If you're a model railroader, you know that the right backdrop can make all the difference in creating a realistic scene. But finding the perfect backdrop can be a real challenge. You also know that buying commercial backdrops can be very expensive and you're limited to what the manufacturers think will sell. So how do you get a custom photo backdrop and how do you get it at a reasonable price? Well, today we're talking about finishing this custom photo backdrop and then I'm going to show you how you can print it at home. Hi everybody, I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot, where we give model railroaders the knowledge, tools, and services they need to build a realistic layout and the motivation to work on it right now. In the first installment of this video, we talked about resolution, color, and the basics of using GIMP. If you don't remember, GIMP stands for GNU Image Manipulation Program, and it's a free open source image editing program that, among other things, can help you create custom backdrops for your model railroad. And the best part is, you don't need to be an expert to use it. All you need are some photos, a little creativity, and maybe a little practice. If you missed that first installment, I'd suggest checking it out first before watching this video. There's a link above and in the description below. At the end of that video, we had finished adding the wall images, and now we'll pick up where we left off and put in some finishing touches, including a sidewalk, a haze effect, and a fire hydrant. Then we'll talk about how you can print this large image on a standard home printer. So let's get into it.
Well, bring out the GIMP.
Let's go ahead and open that sidewalk image. It opens in its own window, so we do the same thing we did before, which is select it, copy it to the clipboard, and paste it into a new layer on our final image. When I created the original backdrop for the Grunge, I found a sidewalk image somewhere that I used, but I've been unable to locate the image, and so I decided to grab a piece of the sidewalk from my original backdrop image in Photoshop and use it here. Now what I'm going to do is make that sidewalk image available to anyone free of charge so that you can use it. You can follow the link in the description to my Patreon page, and you'll be able to download that file even if you're not a patron. Just like before, we're going to use a combination of our Move tool and the Unified Transform tool to manipulate the sidewalk so that it fits. Now you may notice on this image that all I did was take a small section that repeats on my backdrop from this curb line to this curb line. So we're going to copy and paste it again and just line up those curb lines, repeating that all the way across until we have a sidewalk that covers the entire image. Now this last one will go beyond the end of the image, but that's okay, as we'll see in a minute. And so now we have our sidewalks. Now you'll notice that because I didn't make a new layer for each copy of the sidewalk image before I pasted them, all those pieces are in the same layer. Now in this case, at least to me, that's preferable, so I'm not going to worry about it. We're at the point now where we want to crop the image down to its final size. To do that, I'm going to use our rectangular selection tool to select everything up to the edge, and I do that by clicking with the left mouse button and dragging. Now the selection isn't final until I let go of the mouse button. Then from the image menu, select Crop to Selection. You'll see that it cuts everything down to only the area we selected. So you want to make sure that when you select, it's got all the pieces that you want to include. That's also why the extra space that we included initially and the extra sidewalk doesn't matter, because we can just crop the image down to what we need. Next, we're going to add an effect. So in the real world, you may notice that the further things are away from you, the less sharp they appear. This is the effect of us looking through the atmosphere and any moisture that happens to be in the air, and so at a distance it makes it hard to see things clearly. To our eyes, this may appear as a light gray cast when you're viewing things. Since this building is supposed to be at least a short distance away from the foreground buildings on the layout, I'm going to add some of this effect to our image to dull it down just a tiny bit. So we're going to represent this by adding a little color. Let's create another new layer for this coloration, and this one we're going to call gray. Very clever, very creative.
Very cool, very cool, very nice.
Now we're going to set the color, and we do this from the color palette, which is here on the screen. This shows what the foreground color is going to be, and this other one shows what the background color would be. That comes in handy when you're doing blends and so on, but we're not doing that, so we don't really need to worry about the background color for this image. If I click on the foreground square, it'll bring up a palette of colors. Here it shows the current color and the old color. If I select colors by clicking or typing in color values, the color shown next to the current label changes so that you can compare what you've selected to the previous color. Now I want to use a gray color, Truthfully, that original color was probably pretty good, but we'll change it just so you can see the difference. So we click OK, and that is now our foreground color. We'll make sure our gray layer is selected, then click the Paint Bucket tool, and then click anywhere in the image, and it's going to fill the whole space with that gray color. Well, that's a problem. Looks like we're going to have a serious fog warning from the National Weather Service. All our previous work is still there, and this highlights why we use a program like this instead of a program like Paint. If we used Paint with its single layer, all of our work would have just been lost. In this case, our gray color is just in its own layer that we can control independently. If I hide this layer, you can see that everything behind it is still there. But to represent the humidity in the atmosphere, we do want to add this gray color, and that's why I did this. But we only want a little bit of gray. The way that we can fix that is to adjust the opacity. Now, the opacity value represents how much can be seen through the layer. We start at 100% on our gray layer, which means nothing from behind is going to show through. But if I click on the opacity value, and honestly I have no idea why when I do that GIMP changes the value from 100 to 89%, but that change does highlight what I'm talking about, because now you can see some of the background image through the gray. It's no longer a solid gray color. But it still does look like pea soup fog, so we're still going to need to tone it down some more. To get the effect we want, we'll change this to 10% and see how that looks. Once we do, you can still see all the details of the image in those back layers, but now it's got this hazy look about it. And to prove that there actually is something going on here, watch while I turn the layer visibility on and off. It'll be obvious. Right now the layer is on, now it's off. On, off. So you can see that when it's off, those colors are much brighter, and when the layer is on, the color is a little bit more muted, and this represents it being further in the distance. At this point, we could actually call this image done, and in fact, for the grunge, this was where I stopped, but you could keep going, adding as many or as few details as you want. Now, this has been a relatively simple project. We talked about layers, but for this project here, we only have a couple of images and they're not really stacked on top of one another except for the sidewalk. So using layers was handy, but it didn't really play a huge role in the image creation. But using layers, you could really go to town if you wanted to. In fact, I've been working on a backdrop for my main layout, the Monument City Terminal Division, to go behind my Canton Railroad yard. And that has large trees and bushes and overgrowth and debris and all kinds of different things in it. And to create that, I'm using a whole bunch of pictures I took in Baltimore, and those are all being blended together using many, many layers. So just to drive home this concept of using layers to stack things, we're going to add a fire hydrant. So let me zoom in a little here. What I did was go to Google Images and I just found a picture of a fire hydrant that I liked. So we're going to make a new layer, then copy from Google Images and paste it into the layer in GIMP. Now you'll notice that this fire hydrant image has a white background in it, and that would be a problem if we tried to use it as is. So we need to get rid of that background. To do that, we're going to use the fuzzy selection tool, and it works like this. When you click on any point on an image with the fuzzy selection tool, it chooses everything that is contiguous to the point you clicked on that it thinks is a close color match. Now notice, even though this whole fire hydrant is red, your eye tells you that it has different shades. GIMP's going to do something similar. So if I click here, it selects anything it deems close to the same shade that is connected to the pixel I clicked on. Likewise, if I go over here where it's more in the shadow, it'll pick those darker bits. Where this is going to come in handy is to help us get rid of the background, since it's all the same color. So if I click anywhere on the white background, it's going to select all the white. Now on the screen it might be a little hard to tell, but it has selected the whole background. Now if I click the delete key or select delete from the right click menu, this removes all the white, leaving us with only the image of the hydrant. But it's still way too big and in the wrong place. To remedy that, using the Move tool, I can move it roughly to the spot we want to place it, select the hydrant, then use the Transform tool to change the size. It's basically the same process we used on our walls before. I'm just going to eyeball this here and shrink it down. Now I know it looks like it's made a copy, but it hasn't. The way the tool is working right now is that until I click off of it, it leaves the original view there. This is a little different than how it seemed to work when we resized the walls, and to be honest, I don't know why. But we'll adjust it until it looks like a reasonable size, And now if I click on a different tool, GIMP will render the changes, and the result is an appropriately sized fire hydrant. But we have another problem, and that is that our hydrant layer is in front of our gray haze layer. So we'll need to move that layer down behind the gray. And normally I could do that just by grabbing the layer and moving it down. But I can't. If I was actually moving the layer, there would be a white bar that would show me where it was going to place that layer in the order. After some research, I found the problem, and it wasn't a GIMP problem, but a conflict between GIMP and the software I use to capture the screen video. But normally all you do is grab the layer name and move it down. As a result, I had to move the layer off camera, so for this part you're going to have to trust me a little bit. You can see here that the hydrant is very bright. I'm going to shut my software off, move the layer, and come back. Hey, look at that, I'm back, and you barely even noticed. But anyway, you can now see that the fire hydrant layer has moved down in the order, and on the screen it appears more muted, not quite so bright. So that wraps up image creation. All that's left now is to print the image. Now if you decide to take the image to a commercial printer and have them print the whole thing on a long banner, all you're going to need to do is export this file as a JPEG and go. But I'm going to assume that you're going to do what I did, which was to print this out at home. Now I'm fortunate enough to have a color laser printer, so I decided to simply print the image as tiles here at home, cut them out, and assemble them on the backdrop. You could also print them using an inkjet printer, but just make sure not to get the printout wet, as the ink will run. This can be especially problematic if you're going to use water-soluble scenery later. Speaking of assumptions, you could assume that if you just decided to click print on this, the program would do the right thing and print out a series of files for you to cut out and attach together, and you'd be done. That assumption would be wrong. So we're going to have to manipulate the file to get tiles that are sized appropriately for 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, and I'll show you how. What we want to do is use the canvas capability of GIMP to incrementally cut the image down into a bunch of 7" by 10.5" chunks on the screen. That way, when we go to print this, the program is only trying to print what's visible on the screen at that time. In this way, we can line up the printouts end to end and make what looks like a continuous image, even though it's made up of a bunch of individual pages. So why 7" by 10.5"? Well, we're going to print these in landscape mode, which means that the paper is wider than it is tall. So the 7" height will fit easily in the printable area of the paper. But the reason for using 10.5" is that while the paper is 11 inches wide, most printers require a margin of at least 1/4 inch on each edge. So our maximum printable size is 10.5". To print, we want to cut the canvas down to multiple 7" by 10.5" sections, and then we'll print each one. So from the image menu, I'm going to select canvas size. You'll note that our full image size is almost 48 inches wide by 7 inches high. And since we can only print 10.5" at a time, I'm going to set this to 10.5, and I'm not going to touch the height. For this first section, we're not going to do anything about the offset either. Now watch what happens when I click resize. Instead of having this huge image, it's been cut down to the leftmost 10.5" section. You can still see the outline of the original image, which tells us that it's all still there, but we're only viewing this piece. And when you print it, it will only print what is showing. To get back to full size, I click Undo from the Edit menu or press Ctrl-Z. Starting with the second piece is when things start to get a little tricky. Now we're going to use the offset function of GIMP so that we can move across the entire image and get all the pieces that we need. The offset value, in conjunction with the height and width, tells GIMP how far from the edge we want our 7" by 10.5" chunk to start from. I'll also need to enter the offset as a negative number because, well, I don't know why. But GIMP won't let me put in a positive number, so negative numbers it is. There must be some reason for this, and if you know what it is, please let us all know in the comments below. And you can see in the small preview here what it's going to do to the image itself. So when I click resize, it shrinks down to the next 10.5". Since I only offset the image by 10 inches, that's going to give us a duplicate section on this left side that will allow us to overlap the edges so there are no visible seams. We're going to repeat that process all the way across. So we undo again, and we're back to full size. Now we've printed our first 10.5" section and a second 10.5" section offset by 10 inches. Now we're going to do the third one, set it to 10.5 and offset it again, but this time the offset will be 20.5 inches, which we got to by taking the 10 inches of the original offset and then the 10.5" width of the image. And then we'll keep going, offsetting the next one by 31 inches. And at the end, that'll leave us with this section here, which would not fill a whole sheet anyway. Now to get that last sheet, we'll offset by 41.5 inches. And what the program automatically does is give you a full 10.5 inch section starting from the right side. Now all this means is that on this last piece, there's going to be a larger overlap than what you had for other images. And that's how you go about getting the printouts. We haven't saved this in a while, so let's go ahead and do that. It's going to save as an XCF file, which is GIMP's proprietary file format. And what that's going to do is save all the settings that are in here. That's layers and opacities and the other things, so that you can go back and edit this. And when you do that, all the elements stay as they were. But if you were going to take this to a commercial printer, you'd want to export the entire image to something more printer friendly, like a JPEG. To get a JPEG, I need to export the image. What it wants to do by default is save this as a PNG file, but I want to export it as a JPEG. When I select that, it will change the file extension to .jpg. When I save, this is what I get. So that's the technique I use to create the backdrop image for the Grunge. Once you have some experience with the software, it's actually pretty easy to do all these steps, and the more practice you have, the more creative you can get. Now I know that software like this isn't everyone's cup of tea, and some people might feel like they just can't make it work. So if you fall into that category but would still like a custom backdrop, I'm available for consulting for jobs like this and other things such as layout design and track planning. To find out more, you can drop me a line at jparker@thepixeldepot.com. Have you ever created your own backdrop like this? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. That's also the place for questions and suggestions. If you're looking for more model railroading ideas, I've got you covered. To see the series on creating the Grunge, which is the small shelf layout you see behind me, you can click on the link in the upper left. If you missed the first entry in this two-part series on creating a custom photo backdrop, you can click below that. I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll meet me next time in the train room.